Yes, medieval people had mirrors, but they were not the mirrors we know today. When we think of a mirror, we picture a clear, perfect reflection on a sheet of glass. We see ourselves exactly as we are. That experience was almost impossible for most of history. For someone living in the year 1200, seeing their own face clearly was a rare and strange thing. The first mirror for any human was a still pool of water. On a calm day with the sun just right, you could look down and see a version of yourself. It was a fleeting image. A ripple from a breeze, a passing cloud, or a dropped stone would shatter it. This was nature's mirror. It was temporary and imperfect. It showed you a face, but it was a dark and wavering one. It was a reflection tied to a place and a moment. You couldn't take it with you. For a more permanent reflection, people turned to stone. Not just any stone. They used obsidian, a type of volcanic glass. When polished, obsidian creates a dark, glossy surface. It gives a deep, almost magical reflection. The ancient Romans used it. People in the Americas used it for centuries. A medieval European might have encountered one, perhaps as an ancient artifact or a curiosity from afar. But they were not common. The reflection was dark, like looking into black water. It showed shapes and outlines, but not fine details. You could see your silhouette, but maybe not the tiredness in your eyes. The most common type of mirror in the Middle Ages was made of metal. These were the everyday mirrors for those who could afford one. They were usually made of polished bronze. Sometimes they used a special alloy called speculum metal, a mix of tin and copper that could take a very high polish. Silver was also used, but it was incredibly expensive and tarnished quickly. Imagine one of these metal mirrors. It was not a large, wall-mounted object. It was small, usually round, and designed to be held in the hand. It might have been the size of your palm. The surface was not perfectly flat like modern glass. It was slightly curved from the polishing process. The reflection it gave was not bright and clear. It was dim. It had a yellowish or grayish tint from the metal itself. You had to hold it in good light to see anything properly. And it was a constant chore to maintain. Metal tarnishes. Exposure to the air would dull its shine. Every few days, the mirror's owner, or more likely their servant, would have to polish it. They would use a fine abrasive powder, like ash or powdered bone, and a soft cloth. They would rub and rub until the shine returned. But this constant polishing took a toll. It would leave tiny scratches on the surface. Over time, the mirror would become hazy, its reflection even more blurry. So, the medieval experience of seeing oneself was fundamentally different from ours. It was a darker, softer, and less detailed view. It was a glimpse, not a steady gaze. You could check if your hat was on straight or if you had food on your face, but you couldn't study your own expression in the way we can. The person looking back at you from a polished bronze disc was a shadowy version of you. There was another kind of mirror, one made of glass, but these were also nothing like our modern mirrors. They were small, convex bubbles of glass backed with a layer of molten lead. Think of a Christmas ornament, but with a metal backing. Because they were curved, they distorted the reflection, they made things look smaller and warped like a funhouse mirror. They were more of a novelty item, a curiosity for the rich. They were sometimes called witch balls and hung in windows to ward off evil spirits. They captured a wide, distorted view of the room, a fisheye lens perspective. They could show you movement and color, but they could not show you your true face. This was the world of reflection before the modern mirror arrived. It was a world of imperfect images. Seeing yourself was a luxury, and even then it was an unclear one. The phrase from the Bible, "For now we see through a glass, darkly," made perfect sense to them. It was their daily reality. They saw themselves through a dim, polished piece of metal. A true, honest reflection was something yet to come. It was a technological puzzle waiting to be solved. Making a mirror in the Middle Ages was a job for a skilled craftsman. It was not a simple process. It required muscle, patience, and a deep understanding of materials. The men who made mirrors were not called mirror makers. They were metalworkers, smiths, or founders. They worked with fire and force to shape a tool for seeing. Let's focus on the most common type, the metal mirror. The process started with the metal itself. Bronze was a popular choice, but the best metal mirrors were made from speculum, an alloy of copper and tin, with a bit of arsenic sometimes added. The name comes from the Latin word for mirror. This alloy was brittle and difficult to work with, but it could be polished to a higher reflectivity than almost any other metal. And it could shine almost like silver, but it didn't tarnish as quickly. The craftsman would start by melting the metal in a crucible, a ceramic pot that could withstand intense heat. Once the metal was molten, it was poured into a mold. This was often a simple mold made of sand or clay, shaped like a flat disc. This disc would be the raw form of the mirror. It would be rough and uneven. After it cooled, the real work began. The disc had to be made perfectly flat and smooth. This was done through a long process of grinding and polishing. The craftsman would use a series of abrasive materials, starting with coarse sand and moving to finer and finer powders. He would rub the disc against a flat stone, grinding away the imperfections. It was slow, laborious work. He had to be careful to keep the pressure even, to avoid creating dips or high spots on the surface. The final stage was polishing. This was the most critical step. It was what turned a dull piece of metal into a reflective surface. The craftsman would use very fine powders like emery or tripoli mixed with water or oil. He would rub the surface with a piece of leather or soft cloth for hours. The goal was to remove every last tiny scratch to make the surface as smooth as possible. The smoother the surface, the clearer the reflection. A master polisher could create a surface that was remarkably bright. These mirrors were almost always small. A large metal mirror would have been incredibly heavy and very difficult to polish evenly. Most were designed to be held in the hand or carried in a pouch. Because the polished surface was delicate and easily scratched, they often came with a protective case. These cases could be simple leather pouches, or they could be elaborate works of art in their own right. Wealthy patrons would commission cases made of carved ivory, wood, or even precious metals like gold and silver. The cases were often decorated with scenes from romantic stories or religious allegories. The mirror itself was a luxury, and its case was a way to display that luxury. The cost of such an object was high. The raw materials were not cheap, but the real cost was in the labor. It took many days of skilled work to produce a single small mirror. This meant that only the wealthy could afford one. A nobleman, a rich merchant, or a high-ranking church official might own a metal mirror. For a peasant working the fields, such an object was unimaginable. Their only mirror was the village well or a bucket of water. The owners of these mirrors also had to deal with their upkeep. A metal mirror was in a constant state of decay. The air itself was its enemy. Moisture and oxygen would cause the surface to tarnish, turning the bright reflection into a dull, cloudy image. To fight this, the mirror had to be polished regularly. This was often the job of a servant. They would use a special cloth and a gentle polishing powder, sometimes called putty powder, to restore the shine. But each polishing wore away a tiny amount of the metal and added microscopic scratches. A mirror was not a permanent object. It was a thing that had to be cared for, a thing that would slowly wear out with use. The men who made these objects were part of a long tradition of metalworking. Their skills were passed down from master to apprentice. They worked in noisy, dusty workshops, surrounded by the heat of the forge and the smell of hot metal. They were not creating a simple tool. They were creating an object that touched on deep human desires, the desire to see oneself, to know one's own face. They were shaping metal into a window. It was a dim and cloudy window, but for the people of the time, it was the only one they had. They were the craftsmen who gave the Middle Ages its own reflection. For centuries, the world of mirrors was dominated by polished metal. Glass mirrors existed, but they were small, convex novelties. They distorted reality. The dream was to combine the flatness of a metal mirror with the bright, untarnishing quality of glass. The place where that dream became reality was an island in a lagoon in northern Italy. That place was Murano, the glassmaking center of Venice. By the late Middle Ages, Venice was a powerhouse of trade and industry. And its most famous industry was glass. The Venetian glassmakers were the best in the world. Their skills were so valuable that in 1291, the government of Venice ordered all glass foundries to move to the island of Murano. Officially, this was to reduce the risk of fire in the crowded city, but it also served another purpose. It made it easier to guard the secrets of the glassmakers. The artisans of Murano were treated well, but they were also virtual prisoners. They were forbidden from sharing their techniques with outsiders. Leaving Murano without permission could mean death. For a long time, the Murano glassmakers made the same convex mirrors as everyone else. They would blow a large sphere of glass. While it was still hot, they would pour a mixture of tin and mercury and amalgam inside. They would swirl it around to coat the interior. Once it cooled, they would cut the sphere into smaller, curved pieces. These were better than lead-backed mirrors, but they were still not the flat, true mirrors people wanted. The first major breakthrough was in the glass itself. The Venetians perfected the creation of cristallo, a clear, colorless, and flawless glass that resembled rock crystal. This was a huge step forward, but the biggest challenge remained how to create large, perfectly flat sheets of glass. Blowing a sphere would always result in a curve. The solution was the cylinder method. A glass blower would blow a long cylindrical bubble of glass. Then, while it was still hot, they would cut off the ends and slice the cylinder down its length. The cylinder could then be unrolled and flattened into a sheet on a special stone table. This was an incredibly difficult process that required immense skill, but it produced something new: clear, flat panes of glass. This flat glass changed architecture, it made large windows possible, and it opened the door for a new kind of mirror. The final piece of the puzzle was the backing. The old method of pouring molten metal into a sphere wouldn't work on a flat sheet. The Venetians developed a new revolutionary technique. It was a closely guarded secret for over 150 years. Here is how it worked. A large, perfectly smooth stone table was used. On this table, they would lay a sheet of tinfoil, carefully smoothing out every wrinkle. Then came the dangerous part. They would pour liquid mercury over the tin. Mercury is a strange and beautiful metal, liquid at room temperature. It would cover the tinfoil in a shimmering layer. Then, with incredible care, they would slide the sheet of flat glass onto the mercury-covered tin. The glass would float on the liquid mercury. They would then place weights on top of the glass to press it down. This squeezed out the excess mercury. The mercury in the tin would then begin to form a chemical bond, an amalgam. This amalgam had the property of adhering firmly to the back of the glass. The process took weeks. The mirror had to sit, weighted down, as the amalgam slowly hardened. The result was a thin, highly reflective layer of metal permanently bonded to the back of a perfectly clear, flat piece of glass. The result was astonishing. For the first time, people could see a bright, clear, and undistorted reflection of themselves. A Venetian mirror was a marvel. It was a piece of magic. It was also incredibly expensive. The process was complex, the materials were costly, and the secret was held by only a few. A single large Venetian mirror could cost as much as a naval ship. It was an object of ultimate luxury, affordable only to kings, popes, and the wealthiest princes of Europe. There was a dark side to this beautiful invention. Mercury is highly toxic. The fumes from the process would slowly poison the workers. They suffered from tremors, memory loss, and a host of other debilitating health problems. The phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from the use of mercury in hat making, which caused similar neurological damage. The mirror makers of Venice paid a heavy price for their craft. They created perfect reflections, but their work slowly destroyed their own bodies. The Venetian mirror marked the end of the medieval era of reflection and the beginning of the modern one. It was a product of the late Middle Ages, a precursor to the Renaissance. It shifted the idea of a mirror from a small, personal object for a quick glimpse to a large, architectural feature that could reflect entire rooms and the people in them. The shadowy, bronze-tinted medieval self was replaced by a bright, clear, and detailed image. The secret of Murano didn't just change how mirrors were made, it changed how people saw themselves. As a mirror in the Middle Ages was never just a tool, it was an object loaded with meaning. It reflected not just a person's face, but also their wealth, their piety, and their deepest anxieties. Its rarity made it powerful. How it was used and what people thought about it tells us a lot about the medieval world. First and foremost, a mirror was a symbol of status. Owning any kind of mirror, even a small, polished bronze one, meant you were not a peasant. It meant you had disposable income. It placed you in the upper echelons of society. Inventories of castles and wealthy merchant homes from the period sometimes list a mirror among the silver plates, tapestries, and other treasures. They were valuable enough to be passed down in wills. The mirror's case was often as important as the mirror itself. Many surviving medieval mirrors are actually just the cases, the delicate metal discs having long since been lost or corroded. These cases, often made of intricately carved ivory, show us who used them and why. They were frequently decorated with scenes of courtly love. A knight presenting a flower to a lady, or couples playing chess. This suggests that mirrors were often love tokens, gifts exchanged between aristocratic lovers. They were part of the ritual of courtship. A lady could use the mirror to check her appearance, but the object itself was a constant reminder of the giver. With the arrival of the breathtakingly expensive Venetian glass mirrors, their role as a status symbol exploded. These were not hidden away in a pouch, they were displayed. They were framed in ornate, gilded wood and hung on the walls of palaces. To own one was the ultimate display of wealth and sophistication. It told every visitor that you were powerful, modern, and connected. Often, the mirror was more valuable than any painting in the room. It was a piece of high technology, a wonder of the age. But the mirror also had a much darker side in the medieval mind. It was deeply connected to the sin of vanity, or pride, the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. Sermons and moral tales warned against the dangers of looking at oneself too much. The ancient story of Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away, was a popular cautionary tale. A woman who spent too much time in front of her mirror was seen as vain and frivolous, concerned with her fleeting earthly beauty rather than the state of her immortal soul. In religious art, the mirror often appeared as a symbol for vanity. A painting of a richly dressed woman admiring herself in a mirror was a clear message to the viewer. Sometimes a demon would be shown holding the mirror for her, tempting her into sin. The mirror could be a tool of the devil, encouraging self-obsession and distracting people from God. At the same time, the mirror could also be a symbol of purity and truth. The Virgin Mary was sometimes associated with a mirror, described as a speculum sine macula, a mirror without a spot. This meant she perfectly reflected the grace of God without any stain of sin. In this context, the mirror was a symbol of a pure soul. It represented the ideal of reflecting God's light into the world. A good Christian soul was supposed to be a clean mirror for God. A sinner's soul was a dirty, tarnished mirror that gave a distorted reflection. This duality, the mirror as a tool for both vanity and virtue, shows the complex relationship people had with the idea of self-image. They were fascinated by it, but also deeply suspicious of it. Beyond religion and status, mirrors were also tied to magic and the supernatural. The reflective surface was seen as a portal to another world or a way to see things that were hidden. The practice of scrying, or divination, often involved using a mirror, a bowl of water, or a polished stone. The scryer would gaze into the surface, hoping to see visions of the future or events happening far away. John Dee, the famous advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, used a black obsidian mirror for this very purpose, an object that had likely come from Aztec Mexico. There was also a common folk belief that a mirror could capture a part of a person's soul. This is the origin of the superstition that breaking a mirror brings 7 years of bad luck. The idea was that your soul, trapped in the broken pieces, would be fractured. It's also why people in some traditions cover mirrors in a house where someone has died to prevent the deceased's spirit from being trapped in the glass. So, the medieval mirror was a complicated object. For the wealthy lady, it was a tool for grooming and a romantic keepsake. For the prince, it was a declaration of power. For the priest, it was a metaphor for the human soul, capable of reflecting either sin or divine grace. And for the common person, it was a mysterious and powerful object tied to stories of magic and superstition. It was far more than just a way to see your face. It was a way of thinking about your place in the world, your relationship with God, and the very nature of your soul. The shift from a dim metal disc to a clear sheet of Venetian glass was more than just a technological improvement. It was a psychological revolution. Like, the arrival of the clear true mirror in the late Middle Ages fundamentally changed how people saw not just their faces, but their very selves. It helped plant the seeds for the modern concept of the individual. Think about a life lived without ever seeing a clear reflection. Your sense of your own face would be based on the reactions of others, on an artist's rendering, or on the murky, distorted image in a piece of polished bronze. You would know the faces of your family and friends better than you knew your own. Your identity was primarily external and communal. You were a member of a family, a village, a guild, a church. Your sense of self was tied to these groups. The clear mirror changed that. It offered a private, one-to-one encounter with yourself. For the first time, you could study your own features with objective clarity. You could see the lines around your eyes, the exact shade of your hair, the way your expression changed when you felt an emotion. This experience, which is so commonplace for us, was a profound and startling novelty for them. It fostered a new kind of self-awareness, an inward-looking curiosity. It encouraged people to think of themselves not just as part of a group, but as unique individuals with a distinct physical presence. This new way of seeing had a huge impact on art. The rise of the realistic self-portrait is directly linked to the improvement of mirror technology. Before the 15th century, self-portraits were rare and usually stylized. An artist might paint himself into a crowd scene, but it wasn't a detailed study of his own face. Then, artists like John van Eyck began to explore this new vision. In his famous Arnolfini portrait from 1434, there is a small, convex mirror on the back wall. In that mirror, you can see a tiny, distorted reflection of the entire room, including 2 figures standing in the doorway, one of whom is presumed to be the artist himself. It was a stunning display of technical skill, a way of showing off his mastery of reflection. As flat glass mirrors became slightly more available, artists began to use them to look at themselves directly. Albrecht Dürer, at the end of the 15th century, created a series of powerful, introspective self-portraits. He painted himself with a level of detail and psychological depth that was completely new. He looked at his own face with an unflinching analytical eye. He was not just painting an artist, he was painting a specific man, with his own thoughts, fears, and ambitions. This would have been almost impossible without a good mirror. The mirror gave artists the tool to study the human subject that was always available themselves. This, in turn, fueled the Renaissance fascination with humanism and the individual. The mirror also changed ideas about beauty and grooming. When you can see yourself clearly, you become more aware of your appearance. Fashion became more important for the elite who had access to mirrors. Cosmetics, hairstyling, and the fine details of clothing could be examined and perfected. The mirror created a new relationship between a person and their physical body. This transition was slow. For most of the Middle Ages, the old, dim mirrors were the norm. Clear glass mirrors were a luxury for the super rich, a wonder that most people would never see. But the idea of a clear reflection had been born, and over the next few centuries, as the Venetian secret eventually leaked out and other countries began making their own mirrors, the technology spread. The price came down. By the 17th and 18th centuries, mirrors were becoming a common feature in middle-class homes. Our modern world is saturated with reflections. We wake up and look in the bathroom mirror. We catch our reflection in shop windows, in the dark screen of our phones, in the rearview mirror of a car. We see ourselves hundreds of times a day, often without even thinking about it. We live in a hall of mirrors. This constant self-viewing has shaped our culture, our psychology, and our sense of identity in ways we barely recognize. To understand the medieval world, we have to try to imagine this away. We have to imagine a time when a glimpse of your own face was a rare event, a privilege. A time when the face that looked back at you was a dim, shadowy stranger. The answer to the question is yes, medieval people had mirrors. But the journey from their mirrors to ours is the story of how we learn to see ourselves. It was a slow, quiet revolution that moved from a dark piece of polished metal to a perfect sheet of glass, and in doing so, it brought the modern individual into focus for the very first time.